The sun had just started to set over the small town of Brookstone, casting long shadows across the well-kept houses and neatly manicured lawns. Inside the Smith household, a dark storm was brewing, though no one could have predicted just how far the storm would go. Nathan Smith, a strong-willed man in his early 40s, had always prided himself on being the protector of his family. His wife, Angela, and his two sons, Jared and Kyle, were his world. But as often happens in families, things were not always as perfect as they seemed. Jared, his 18-year-old son, had always been the quiet one. He kept to himself, focused on his studies, and was respectful toward his father. But for some time now, Nathan had sensed a change in Jared's behavior. He had become withdrawn, often locking himself in his room for hours at a time, and when he did speak, it was with a cold distance that Nathan hadn't seen before. Nathan's suspicions began to grow when he found strange, anonymous text messages on Jared's phone. The messages were intimate in nature, something that didn't sit right with Nathan. Who was Jared talking to, and why were the conversations so personal? As days passed, Nathan's curiosity turned to paranoia. One evening, while Angela was out grocery shopping, Nathan decided to confront Jared. He walked to Jared's bedroom door, hesitated for a moment, and then barged in without knocking. "Jared, we need to talk," Nathan demanded, his voice filled with authority. Jared looked up from his desk, clearly startled. "What's going on, Dad?" "I found your phone," Nathan said, holding it up in his hand. "Who are you talking to like this? What's going on?" Jared's face paled and his heart raced. He knew this day would come. His father had always been a man of control and discipline, and this confrontation was inevitable. "Dad, I can explain." Nathan's face grew hard. "Explain? Explain what, Jared? What's this nonsense?" Jared took a deep breath and sat down on the edge of his bed. His hands were shaking. "Dad, it's something I need to tell you. It's not what you think." Nathan's anger flared up. "Then tell me what it is. What's going on?" Jared hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. I'm gay," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I've been seeing Kyle. I love him." Nathan's world stopped. He blinked, unable to process the words that his son had just spoken. Kyle, his 16-year-old stepson, his own flesh and blood, the boy he had raised since he was a toddler. The thought was incomprehensible. "Are you out of your mind?" Nathan's voice was filled with disbelief. "Kyle? My own son? You've been sleeping with him?" He could feel the anger boiling inside him, pushing him to the edge. Jared stood up, his voice shaking. "It's not like that, Dad. We didn't plan it. It just happened. We didn't know what to do." Nathan's fists clenched at his sides, his face turning red with rage. "You think I'm going to let this slide? You think I'm going to let my family be destroyed because of this sickness?" Jared took a step back, fear filling his eyes. He had never seen his father this angry. Nathan's temper was legendary, but this was something different, something much darker. Before Jared could say another word, Nathan lashed out, striking him across the face. Jared stumbled back, his lip bleeding from the blow. He tried to regain his balance, but his father was already on him, his fists flying in a blur of rage. "You're going to learn what happens when you disgrace this family," Nathan hissed, his voice full of venom. "You and your brother both." Jared tried to shield himself, but Nathan's strength was too much. Blow after blow rained down on him, and the pain became unbearable. As his vision blurred, Jared's thoughts were consumed with one desperate wish, that someone would stop this madness before it was too late. But there was no one, and soon Jared's world went black. The next morning, Angela returned home from her errands, bags of groceries in hand. As she entered the house, she immediately noticed something was off. The silence was thick, and the usual sounds of Jared playing video games or Kyle watching TV were absent. She walked into the living room and called out, "Nathan? Jared? Kyle?" No response. Her heart began to beat a little faster as she placed the bags on the kitchen counter. She moved toward Jared's room, instinctively knowing something was wrong. When she reached the door, it was ajar. She pushed it open and froze at the sight before her. Jared was lying motionless on the floor, his body bruised and swollen, his eyes half open, staring vacantly at the ceiling. Her hands shook as she rushed to his side. "Jared!" she cried, but there was no response. Her mind raced. Had he fainted? Had something happened to him? She reached for his wrist, desperately searching for a pulse. But there was nothing. Just the cold, lifeless stillness of a body too far gone. Angela screamed in terror, her voice cracking. "Nathan!" she shouted, running toward the stairs. Nathan came down the hallway looking disoriented, his face flushed and his hands trembling. "What's wrong?" he asked. But his eyes betrayed him. There was something in his expression, a kind of guilt that made Angela stop dead in her tracks. She saw it then, the dark marks on his knuckles, the blood on his shirt. Her heart skipped a beat. "You did this, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She could hardly believe it. She had known Nathan for over 20 years, and the thought that he could harm their son in such a brutal way was incomprehensible. Nathan's face twisted with fury and shame. "You don't understand, Angela. He—" His voice trailed off, and he glanced toward Jared's lifeless body. "He betrayed me. He betrayed this family." Angela shook her head, her eyes filled with disbelief. "No, no, Nathan. He's our son. How could you? How could you?" "He's a liar, a sinner." Nathan's voice grew louder, more frantic. "He was sleeping with Kyle. He told me everything. He's been lying to us." Angela's breath caught in her throat. "Kyle?" She looked at him in shock. "What are you saying?" Nathan paced back and forth, clearly agitated. "You heard me, Kyle. He's been lying to both of us. Angela couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran back to Jared's room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt by her son's body, her mind numb with horror. Nathan followed her, his footsteps heavy, his voice pleading. "Angela, please, you don't understand. He deserved it." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "What are you talking about? How could you do this? How could you kill him?" Her words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, Nathan stood there staring at his wife. But instead of remorse, all he showed was bitterness. "I had to teach him a lesson. He was destroying our family. This sickness, Angela, it had to stop." Angela stood, backing away from Jared's body, her entire body trembling with shock. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the emergency services number. 911, what's your emergency? My son is dead." Angela sobbed into the phone. "My husband, he killed him." The operator's voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, please stay on the line. I need you to give me your address. Help is on the way." Angela's eyes never left Nathan as she spoke to the dispatcher. She couldn't believe the man standing before her, the man she had loved for so long, could have done something so monstrous. There was a finality to the silence that followed, broken only by the distant wail of sirens growing closer. But Nathan wasn't finished. As if he realized he had no way to take back his actions, he moved toward the stairs. "You don't get it, Angela. You'll understand one day. I did what had to be done." Angela's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him retreat. For the first time in their marriage, she felt truly afraid of him. The doorbell rang moments later, and the arrival of the police and paramedics shattered the tension in the house. Within minutes, the officers moved to secure the scene, and Angela was pulled aside, questioned, and told to remain calm. She had no words, only a hollow emptiness where love for her husband once resided. Detective Lena Hargrave stepped into the house, her eyes immediately drawn to the young man lying lifeless on the floor. She had seen many murder scenes in her career, but the raw grief that radiated from Angela made this one hit harder than most. "Ma'am, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions," Lena said gently. She gestured for the officers to begin their investigation. Angela nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just find out what happened." The detective approached Nathan, who was standing near the stairs, arms crossed, his face hard as stone. Detective Lena Hargrave sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, a notebook in front of her. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and was filled with the constant hum of the building's air conditioning. Across from her sat Nathan Smith, his face hard and unyielding. He had been silent for the past few minutes, staring down at his hands, which were still stained with the faint remnants of blood. Lena's gaze was steady as she looked at him. She had interrogated hundreds of suspects over the years, and there was something in Nathan's demeanor that set off alarm bells. He wasn't just grieving, he was defensive. He was trying to control the narrative. "Nathan," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you what happened last night. From your perspective, can you walk me through it?" Nathan shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering for a moment, but then his gaze hardened once more. He crossed his arms over his chest as though to protect himself. "I already told the officers everything," he muttered, his voice low. "Jared had to be punished." "Punished for what?" Lena asked, her voice still steady, but the question hanging in the air. Nathan exhaled sharply, as if the very act of explaining the truth was something that pained him. "He was sick. He had betrayed the family. He told me that he'd been sleeping with Kyle, my own son, his stepbrother. They were having an affair. You don't know what that does to a father, detective." Lena's pen paused, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You say Jared betrayed you, but you're his father. You were supposed to protect him, not hurt him. What exactly did you think he needed to be punished for?" Nathan's expression twisted with disgust. He was living a lie. He thought he could get away with it. "No son of mine is going to destroy the family. I raised him better than that. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a—" Nathan stopped abruptly, clenching his fists tightly in his lap. "I had to stop it before it got worse." Lena leaned forward slightly. "You said they were having an affair. How did you know that?" Nathan looked down, rubbing his jaw. "I found text messages between them. I found them on Jared's phone. And then when I confronted him, he admitted it. He told me everything." "You didn't talk to Kyle about this?" Lena asked, her eyes sharp. "No," Nathan replied immediately. "I didn't need to. Jared admitted it. There was no point in talking to Kyle." Lena jotted down a few notes, processing the information carefully. The situation didn't add up. Nathan was filled with anger, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. Was this just blind rage, or was there something deeper, more complicated at play? She leaned back in her chair. "You said you confronted Jared. What happened next?" Nathan's jaw clenched again, his entire body tensing as if the memory physically hurt. I tried to talk to him, but he just kept trying to defend himself. He said it wasn't like I thought. He said he loved Kyle, that it wasn't wrong. That's when I lost it. He was disrespecting me. He was disrespecting the family. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen." Lena could see Nathan was struggling with his emotions, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. "What did you do to him?" Nathan's gaze flicked up to hers, cold and unyielding. "I didn't want to hurt him, but he made me do it. I slapped him. Just once. And then he kept talking back, saying horrible things, so I hit him again. I didn't mean to do it, detective. I just lost control." Lena's pen hovered over her notebook as she processed his words. Nathan's version of events was one of a man pushed to the edge, but the severity of Jared's injuries told a different story. From what she had seen at the crime scene, it wasn't just a slap or a quick altercation. Jared had been brutally beaten. His ribs were broken, and there were signs of severe trauma to his head. "Did you hit him with anything?" Lena asked, her voice cautious. Nathan's eyes flickered, and he hesitated before responding. I used my fists. I don't remember exactly, He wouldn't stop. He was disrespecting me. I couldn't let him get away with it. Lena nodded slowly, taking in every detail. She needed to be careful. Every word Nathan spoke was laced with emotion, and she could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else. Something he wasn't telling her. "You mentioned Kyle. Where was he during all of this?" Lena asked, her tone neutral but probing. Nathan paused as though considering the question for the first time. "Kyle, he was in his room. I think he heard us fighting, but he didn't come out. I told him to stay away. I didn't want him involved in this. I just wanted to deal with Jared." Lena's mind was racing. She'd need to speak with Kyle, see if his story matched Nathan's. But there was still something nagging at her. Something didn't feel right. Detective Lena Hargrave stepped into the sterile, brightly lit room where Kyle Smith was waiting. The 16-year-old sat slumped in a chair, his eyes red from crying. His clothes were wrinkled, as though he had been wearing them for hours, and his hands were folded tightly in his lap. His body language was that of someone caught in a whirlwind, unable to control what had happened, but also unsure of how to explain it. Lena sat down across from him, her gaze soft but direct. "Kyle, I know this is a very difficult time for you," she began gently. "I'm not here to judge you, but I do need to understand what happened." Kyle looked up, his face pale, and he swallowed hard, trying to find the words. He had been in this room for what felt like an eternity, but no matter how many times they'd asked him the questions, he couldn't bring himself to tell them the whole truth. He was scared. Scared of what had happened to Jared, scared of his father, and scared of the consequences of everything that had unfolded. Lena studied him closely. She could see the signs of distress on his face, the tremble in his hands. This wasn't just the reaction of someone who had witnessed something traumatic. There was guilt there. Kyle wasn't entirely innocent in this. She had learned from the officers that he hadn't been exactly forthcoming with his statements. But what was he hiding? "I understand this is overwhelming," Lena continued, "but I need you to be honest with me. You need to tell me what happened last night." Kyle's lips quivered, and he nodded but didn't speak at first. Then after a long pause, he whispered, "I never wanted it to happen like this." Lena's voice softened even further. "I know, Kyle. I know. But I need you to start from the beginning. What happened between you and Jared? How did things get to this point?" Kyle took a deep breath and lowered his head, staring at his hands. His fingers were twitching, and he seemed to be wrestling with his thoughts. "Jared and I, we didn't plan it. It just happened. We were close. We always had each other's backs, you know? After my mom married his dad, we spent a lot of time together. It wasn't like we ever thought of each other that way, but one night everything changed." Lena nodded, not interrupting, just listening. She knew the answers wouldn't come easily. Kyle continued, his voice faltering. "It wasn't something I expected, but we kissed one night when we were in his room. We were just talking, but then I kissed him, and he kissed me back." His face flushed with shame, and he looked down at the floor. "I didn't know what to do. It wasn't something I ever planned, but it felt right. And then we started sneaking around. We didn't want anyone to know. It was like some kind of secret, and the more we hid it, the more it became real." Lena's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of confusion. This was an ongoing relationship. They had been hiding it, keeping it from both of their parents. But why hadn't he told anyone? Why hadn't he come forward sooner? "And your father?" Lena asked carefully. "What did he know?" Kyle looked up at her, his expression a mixture of fear and guilt. "He didn't know. He didn't know anything about it. He doesn't understand, Detective. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell anyone. He's not like that. He's old-fashioned. He would have hated me. He would have—" Kyle's voice broke, and he struggled to regain control. "I couldn't risk losing him. I couldn't risk losing everything." Lena sat quietly, absorbing his words. She could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of secrecy that had crushed him for so long. But there was more to this story. She was sure of it. "So when your father confronted Jared," Lena said, choosing her words carefully, "what happened? What did you hear?" Kyle's breath hitched and his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what was going on at first. I heard them yelling, but I stayed in my room. I didn't want to get involved. I thought maybe it was just another one of their fights. But then I heard Jared yelling back at him. He sounded scared, Detective. He didn't deserve it. I could hear Dad hitting him, and I couldn't do anything. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do." Lena leaned in, her expression serious. "You didn't go to Jared's room? You didn't try to stop it?" Kyle shook his head, tears streaming down his face now. I couldn't. I was scared too. I couldn't face him after everything. I couldn't face Dad. I knew he would hate me. I just stayed in my room, hoping it would stop." Lena's mind raced. Kyle's story was heartbreaking, but it raised more questions than answers. She had already heard Nathan's version of events. and it was clear that the confrontation between father and son had escalated quickly. But the level of violence described by both Nathan and Kyle was chilling. The tension in the Smith household had barely begun to subside when Detective Lena Hargrave returned to the crime scene. It was a quiet, somber place now, the once warm and lived-in space transformed by the police tape. The flashing lights of the squad car parked outside, and the presence of forensic specialists working in the background. She had already spoken to Kyle, and while the young man's confession added layers of complexity to the case, something still felt incomplete. She needed answers, and the forensic evidence was the key. Lena made her way through the house, her boots clicking on the wooden floors as she approached the room where Jared had been found. The paramedics had arrived too late to save him, and the police had already sealed off the area for processing. The walls were now marked with the chalk outlines of evidence, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and latex gloves. Detective Jackson, the lead forensic investigator, was crouched near the bed, carefully inspecting the area. He looked up as Lena entered, his expression serious but focused. "Detective Hargrave, we found a few things you'll want to see," he said, standing up and motioning her toward a small table where a set of photographs had been spread out. Lena stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the images. Each photo depicted different parts of Jared's body, each showing signs of extreme violence. Contusions, bruising, lacerations, and most disturbingly, evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. Lena's fingers grazed over one of the photos, where an imprint from a fist was clearly visible on Jared's cheek. It was unmistakable. "The injuries are consistent with what Nathan described, but there's more here than he's told us," Jackson said, his voice low. "The trauma to the skull is severe, a concussion at the very least, but it's possible there's additional internal bleeding. The force used here suggests more than a single blow." Lena's mind began to piece together the fragments of Nathan's story. The father's account had been one of blind rage. Just a few slaps, he claimed. But this didn't match the evidence. Nathan had claimed the assault was over quickly, but the bruising on Jared's body suggested a prolonged beating. "What else did you find?" Lena asked, her gaze still focused on the photographs. "Jared's lip was split open," Jackson replied, gesturing to another image. "There's also a pattern of scratches on his forearms, defensive wounds. He tried to protect himself. But what's most interesting is this." Jackson turned over a photograph, revealing a close-up of a small metallic object. Lena's heart sank as she saw it, a heavy metal belt buckle, partially embedded in the carpet beneath Jared's body. "I don't think this was just a beating, Detective," Jackson continued, his voice steady but tinged with professional concern. "This buckle is consistent with the kind of trauma you'd expect from an object being used to strike someone. It was probably pressed into Jared's chest at some point, and the angle of the bruising around his ribs suggests he was kicked as well. Whoever did this didn't just slap him, they used everything available to them." Lena stood up, her mind racing. The picture was becoming clearer. Nathan's story wasn't adding up, and the forensic evidence was confirming her suspicions. This wasn't a simple confrontation gone wrong. It was a violent and sustained attack. A father unleashing his fury, but it went far beyond what was necessary to teach a lesson. Something more had fueled Nathan's rage, and she needed to know what it was. "Have you been able to determine the time of death?" Lena asked, her voice clipped as she processed the implications. Jackson nodded, tapping his pen against the evidence board. "We estimate that Jared died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. The body was found early this morning, but the signs of rigor mortis indicate that the assault likely took place hours before the call was made." Lena rubbed her forehead, frustrated by the lack of answers. The timeline was starting to make sense. Kyle had described hearing the argument between Jared and Nathan, and the police had noted that Nathan didn't immediately call for help. Instead, he had retreated, leaving Jared to die alone in his room. The pieces were starting to fit together. Nathan had lashed out in anger, but then he had left Jared there to bleed out. "It's the time gap that gets me," Lena murmured, more to herself than to Jackson. "Nathan didn't report the death until much later. Why? Why didn't he act sooner?" Jackson shrugged, his face grim. "That's something you'll have to ask him. But based on the injuries and the time of death, we can conclude that Jared was likely unconscious for a period before he died. He didn't get a chance to fight back. This wasn't just an accident. Lena stood in silence for a moment, letting the evidence sink in. Detective Lena Hargrave stood at the entrance of the interrogation room, staring at Kyle Smith through the one-way mirror. The young man's body language was tight, his posture slumped, and his face marked with the remnants of sleepless nights. His hands twitched slightly as he sat there, waiting for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Lena had just finished reviewing the forensic report, and the discovery of Kyle's DNA under Jared's fingernails had shifted everything. This wasn't just a case of a father losing control. There was more at play here, and Kyle's role in the events of that night had become undeniable. She took a deep breath before entering the room. The door clicked softly as it closed behind her, and Kyle's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear, guilt, and confusion. "Kyle," Lena began, her voice measured but firm. "I know this is hard, but we need to talk about what happened that night. I need you to be completely honest with me." Kyle shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. But there was no going back now. The evidence had spoken, and there was no more room for denial. "I already told you everything," Kyle said in a low voice, his words trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong." Lena sat across from him, her eyes steady. "Kyle, we found your DNA on Jared's body, under his fingernails. That means you were there. You were in the room with him when he was hurt. You have to understand, Kyle, this is serious. You're not just a witness anymore. You're a part of this story." Kyle swallowed hard, his face paling. His eyes darted to the floor, and his lips trembled as if he were trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill. It was clear that the young man was struggling with the weight of his own emotions, but Lena knew that the truth was more important than his fear. "I didn't," Kyle began, but his voice cracked. "I didn't want it to happen like this. I never wanted Jared to die." Lena leaned forward, keeping her tone gentle but insistent. "Tell me what happened, Kyle. From the moment your father came into Jared's room, all the way to the end. Don't leave anything out. You need to let me understand what really happened." For a long moment, Kyle stared at the table, taking in a shuddering breath. His eyes flickered, then lowered, as if he were seeing the entire scene replay in his mind. Then finally the words came out in a broken whisper. "I went to Jared's room that night," Kyle began, his voice barely audible. I don't know why. I guess I just couldn't stay away. I knew Dad and Jared were having it out, but I couldn't just ignore it, so I went in." His hands clenched into fists as he spoke. "I saw Dad yelling at Jared, telling him that he'd ruined everything, that he was a disgrace to the family. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe if I said something, I could calm things down. But then Jared shouted back at him. He said he didn't care about what Dad thought, that he didn't care about being the son Dad wanted him to be. And then Dad just snapped." Kyle's voice trembled with emotion as he continued. "He hit Jared, hard. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stop him. I was so angry, but I was scared too. Jared wasn't fighting back, but Dad just kept hitting him. I could hear the sound of the blows landing. It was horrible, Detective. I knew he was hurting him, but I didn't know how to make him stop." Lena's eyes softened. She could see how torn Kyle was, trapped between loyalty to his father and the love he had for Jared. But there was more to this. She needed to understand what happened next. "What happened after that, Kyle?" she asked. "Did you try to intervene? Did you help Jared?" Kyle looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. I didn't help him. I didn't do anything. I just stood there, frozen. I wanted to. God, I wanted to stop it, but I didn't. And then I heard Jared say something. He said he hated us. He said we were both sick, that we were monsters." Lena's heart tightened at the words. It was clear now that Jared had been trying to fight back emotionally, lashing out with words in the only way he could. But those words seemed to push Nathan over the edge. The father's violent outburst was fueled by more than just anger at the affair. It was a rejection of everything that Jared had come to represent. "And then what?" Lena prompted, her voice calm but insistent. Kyle's breathing grew shallow as he continued, his voice barely a whisper. After Jared said that, Dad kept beating him. I saw him use the belt buckle. He was hitting him with it, over and over. I could see the blood. I could see Jared's face all bruised and swollen. He wasn't moving anymore. But Dad just kept going. I I didn't stop him. I didn't know what to do. I thought I thought Jared was dead, but I didn't say anything. And Dad, he just he just left him there. He didn't even check on him. He didn't care. The trial of Nathan Smith and his son Kyle had drawn attention from across the community, and the media was abuzz with every new revelation. It was a story of violence, betrayal, and the breakdown of a family. The courtroom, once a place of impartiality and justice, now felt like a battleground where the sins of the past were being exposed to the harsh light of truth. Detective Lena Hargrave sat at the back of the courtroom, her eyes focused on the proceedings. She had watched this case unfold from the very beginning, piecing together the fragments of a tragedy that had been building for years. Nathan Smith, the father, sat stoically at the defense table, his face expressionless. His once imposing presence now seemed diminished, as if the weight of his actions had broken something inside him. Kyle, his son, sat beside him, his eyes red and swollen from days of crying. The teenager looked like a lost boy, torn between his loyalty to his father and the crushing guilt of his involvement in the death of Jared. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecutor, a woman named Allison Grant, stood up to present her case. She was seasoned and direct, her voice unwavering as she recounted the details of Jared's death, how he had been brutally beaten by his father, how Kyle had been present, and how neither had done anything to stop it. "The evidence is clear," Allison said, her eyes scanning the room. "Jared Smith did not die from a single blow, nor was his death a result of a fleeting moment of anger. This was a calculated, violent act of abuse, carried out by Nathan Smith with the help of his son. Both Nathan and Kyle Smith contributed to the fatal injury, and both must be held accountable for the life that was lost." Lena had been prepared for the emotional weight of the case, but hearing the prosecutor's words hit her harder than she had anticipated. The shock of the discovery, the realization that a father and son had been so capable of cruelty, had taken its toll on her as well. She had been on many cases, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about justice for the victim. It was about healing the fractured lives of those left behind. As the prosecutor laid out her case, the defense countered with a different narrative. Nathan's lawyer argued that his actions had been fueled by years of emotional and psychological stress. The tension in his marriage, the resentment toward Jared for his affair with Kyle, and his inability to accept his son's sexuality had all played a role in his violent outburst. According to the defense, Nathan had never intended to kill Jared. It was a momentary lapse of judgment that had spiraled out of control. "Nathan Smith is a man who has been under tremendous pressure," the defense attorney argued. The emotional turmoil of his family life, combined with the overwhelming shock of discovering his son's secret affair with his stepson, led him to lash out in a way he never intended. While tragic, this was not premeditated murder. Lena knew this defense was weak. There was no denying Nathan's rage, but the evidence of a prolonged assault, the injuries to Jared's body, the fact that Nathan hadn't called for help, and the defensive wounds on Jared's arms painted a different picture. This wasn't a fit of rage. This was a father who had made a choice to punish his son for something he couldn't understand, and in doing so, he had killed him. When it was Kyle's turn to testify, the room fell silent. His voice was barely above a whisper as he took the stand, his hands shaking and his face pale. He had been through so much, and yet, he still seemed like a child trying to come to terms with the enormity of what had happened. "I never meant for Jared to die," Kyle said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I wanted to help him, but I didn't. I should have done something, but I didn't. And now he's gone." His words hung in the air, heavy with guilt. There was no denying that Kyle had been complicit in the events leading up to Jared's death, but as Lena listened to him speak, she knew there was more to his story. Kyle had been a victim too, caught in the web of a dysfunctional family, unable to break free from the grip of his father's expectations and his own confusion about his feelings toward Jared. He wasn't a murderer, but he had allowed something terrible to happen. After Kyle's testimony, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Everyone knew that the next part of the trial would be the most crucial, the sentencing. The jury deliberated for hours. When they finally returned, Lena felt a weight in her chest. She had seen cases like this before, but this one felt personal. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about finding a way to bring some measure of justice to a family shattered by violence. The judge's voice broke through her thoughts. We, the jury, find Nathan Smith guilty of second-degree murder and Kyle Smith guilty of involuntary manslaughter.